Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today.
Hello, listener. Welcome to Behavior and Risk. As we record this session, we are about 35 days into Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States. He won a resounding victory in the 2024 election, even winning the popular vote over now former Vice President Kamala Harris. He has interpreted the result as a strong mandate for sweeping change, going well beyond what he attempted to achieve in his first term. With that in mind, President Trump has been highly active, dominating the news airwaves almost continuously with executive orders, high-profile policy decisions, highly controversial cabinet appointments, and a massive number of terminations of federal government employees. Like many of his predecessors, he deeply understands that the tone for his presidency will be set during the first 100 days of his term. Unlike them, however, he has taken a unique approach to setting that tone. Instead of focusing on achieving a handful of significant policy changes that he ran on through collaboration with Congress, he is taking what one might view as a scattershot approach to setting policy, often unilaterally through executive order or fiat, with Congress largely relegated to the backbench. His communications jump from one topic to the next. One moment he is commenting on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. The next, he is reinforcing his efforts to remove references to DEIA from all workplaces. And then the next, to rewriting the maps of the world, and so on. In short, the Trump approach to governing is the political application of chaos theory. But is it as chaotic as it may appear? Or is there a method to his madness? What can we, as behavioral scientists, risk managers, investors, executives, and concerned citizens learn from the Trump approach to management?
This is a great question because there is a decided change in tone from Trump's first administration to the second. Historically, we tend to see something of a mellowing of presidents from term one to term two, a perhaps greater willingness to work across the lines, to compromise a bit more, to ensure a lasting legacy. And we're seeing decidedly not that. How much of that is because Trump's first and second terms are discontinuous is difficult to say. But we are seeing definitely far more chaos than we have seen from Donald Trump in the 2016 to 2020 presidential term. Some chaos, I think, is precedented. If you recall, there was a great deal of churn in his initial administration among cabinet members, among inner circle advisors, press secretaries, what have you, a lot of turnover. But the policy and the way that he interacted with Congress and with various legislators and policymakers within the DC area was not nearly so up in the air or variable moment to moment as it is right now. And there are three, I think, dominant narratives or conceptualizations that have emerged about why is he doing this? How is he coming to this approach? The first is that Donald Trump is something of an idiot child who has stumbled his way into success. The second is that he is a bull in a china shop who is solely focused on achieving his outcomes and aims and has no concern for the collateral damage in doing so. Third, and perhaps most controversial, is that he is actually a master manipulator, that he is a master manipulator and a master of the human psyche who knows how to make deals happen and achieve his objectives. Looking at what has been going on through the lens of applied behavioral science, I tend to fall more in that third camp. And I want to emphasize this is not an endorsement nor a rebuttal of his policy, of his goals and objectives. This is just an assessment of his methodology. And I think there is a lot of nuance and sophistication to what he is putting forward. And I think there are very important, powerful lessons we can learn from this.
I agree with that, John. I've come to the conclusion over the last 8 years that he is a master of the mind and he has a clear understanding of human behavior and, in particular, human frailty and weakness. And he often draws upon that in order to achieve bigger goals for himself and those constituents who he deeply cares about.
I agree. There are so many places where we can start here, but I think one of the most important things that frames and contextualizes a great deal of what we're seeing from him is that, especially in this term, Donald Trump seems to not care about what people think of him. The outcomes matter far more than the perception of him as an individual, as a human. And this is something that I think is very easy to overlook or neglect because it's so opposed to what we expect from political operatives in the Washington, D.C. area. Politicians, presidents in particular, historically are enormously concerned with being liked, with being well regarded, with having a positive legacy. And I don't think we're really equipped to understand or properly interpret a politician who doesn't care if they are liked or not.
Yes, he is unencumbered by the need for social approval. And I think that frees him to be who he wants to be and to go after what he wants to go after. I would also suggest that one of the things that I have found difficult in really getting my head around what he does is that emphasis on outcome, in that the ends justify the means. And whatever the source it is that you need to get there to wherever you want to go is perfectly okay. That is actually counter to what we teach in the ERM program. Risk managers are trained specifically to search out root causes for anything that has occurred, because that is the only way that true change can really be enacted. So, for example, we typically don't view reputation in and of itself as a risk. We view that as an intermediate outcome that leads to other outcomes. Instead, we go back to what caused a reputation to suddenly go sour, which could be a variety of things depending on the organization, or if we're talking about a human being, to certain behaviors or certain actions they committed to create such reputation. This is very different than what Donald Trump does, which is very much about, look, this is what I need to get, and it really doesn't matter the path that I take to get there.
It's funny because in the applied behavior space, we come at it a bit differently, where everything comes down to what outcome are you trying to achieve? Typically, a question is put to us of how do we get people to do X? How do we get people to do Y? And we usually have to go back and dig in on, all right, that's the question. What outcome are we trying to achieve? Given that question and given how somebody has phrased this, what are they actually thinking about? And what do they want to happen in the world by putting this question forward? One of the things that I think is really interesting is that there are a lot of different places we could start with this, but I'm going to start with some of his more outlandish statements and positions and apparent aspirations that he's put forward, such as Canada becoming a US state and the US taking over Greenland. I would argue that his opening positions are rarely the outcome he's actually working. There is an outcome in mind, but what he puts out there is not what he's specifically trying to accomplish. And what's going on here is that he is setting a cognitive anchor. He is essentially putting something out there, an opening position that is not really credible, that realistically speaking, I know a few Canadians, I'd say there is a 0% chance that Canada becomes the 51st state of the United States. I think there is a remarkably low probability that Greenland becomes a US territory. But in both cases, I would argue that's probably not what he's working towards. Now, disclaimer, I'm not privy to the inner circle conversations of the Trump administration. It may well be that documentation comes to light in the coming years that invalidates what I'm about to say. But I don't think Donald Trump realistically believes he is going to absorb Canada into the States. He could create internal dialogue and conversation that frees up a lot of Canadian energy policy that benefits the United States. I've seen conversation among Canadians that, particularly among residents of Alberta, of, wait, let's explore this because there is an intense dissatisfaction with energy policy. And there's enough people in Alberta who find the prospect of being absorbed by the states positive that it's going to force a national conversation about probably liberalizing energy policy. Similarly, I don't think Denmark is going to give up Greenland, but I don't think that's the point. I think that there is a whole lot of now Russian ship and submarine activity in the Arctic waters. And given geographic constraints, Denmark is responsible for surveillance and realistically is probably not capable. Greenland is not going to come to the United States, but the United States probably will get some naval bases and Air Force bases on the northern reaches of Greenland. And I would argue that these are the outcomes that he's working towards. Now, this is all a very long-winded way of saying that the opening position creates such an outlandish expectation that the far more contracted actual outcome seems like an easy, reasonable concession just to make him go away. And we've seen this position, this approach used over and over and over again.
That is a great analysis of what I think Trump has used his entire career. And what I would say to anybody who's wondering, gee, how can he do what he's doing? How can he say what he's saying? He has done this for much of his life, for much of his career. It is a big part of the art of the deal is to put out there an anchor that, yes, may be ridiculous, may be completely unrealistic, but it is a starting point. And I would also add that it largely creates a cognitive overload, something that seems so out of bounds, so out of the norm, that it distracts the other side from the underlying issues. And to your point, John, when that more reasonable ask is then brought to the table at some later point, it looks incredibly reasonable and there can be a dialogue around it.
Absolutely. It's framing a conversation, framing a negotiation through that initial cognitive anchor. I see lots of use of cognitive anchors in the Trump administration. And I say the Trump administration, we're really talking about Donald Trump. I see lots of use of cognitive anchors by Donald Trump in his political activities across all manner of practice. And is this something that he is specifically trained in, or is this something that he just has a natural, intuitive understanding of? I couldn't say, but he probably more effectively leverages them than anybody I've seen in the public sphere anywhere in the world.
I think his point of view, and again, I have not read his book, The Art of the Deal. So I want to be very clear. I don't know exactly what he says, but from what I see and how I've observed him operate, is he takes the classic approach. If you don't put it out there, if you don't ask for it, you won't get it. You can't make a shot if you don't shoot, right? That's something that is said in sports all the time. You can't score a goal if you don't take a shot towards the net. And I think his attitude is, if I don't ask for the moon, I haven't got a chance of getting it. Now, I may not get it in the long run, but if I don't ask for it, I have no chance. So I think by making these statements about Canada or Greenland or Gaza, I think he's putting out there a marker for aspiration. And I do think there's something for all of us to learn from that, that if you really want something that's ambitious, you do have to put it out there. You have to put it as part of your consciousness, and not just your own personal consciousness, but the overall general consciousness, so that there can be a dialogue, there can be a discussion, even if there's a lot of ill will and anger and teeth gnashing about it.
And I think he is very effectively playing on that anger and teeth gnashing and frustration by the opposition, and uses disruption of traditional means as a very strong way of creating public support, or at least public inclination towards what he's putting forward. There's been a lot of conversation about his disregard for political norms in DC. Now, you can make the argument that this is probably a big part of why he was elected, in that his electoral support is largely made up of people who are dissatisfied with the traditional way that things happen in DC. Regardless, historically, even the most belligerent and oppositional presidents of any political background work through consensus building. There is a sense of you have to build up your coalition, you have to negotiate with the opposing side, all behind closed doors, until something is ready or at least has a reasonable chance of survival before it is then made public. Donald Trump, of course, turns this on its head by going to the public, going to Twitter, although he's actually using Twitter far less this term, which is probably warrants its own conversation, or making news conferences or press conferences and simply saying, we're going to do X. My intention is that we will undertake policy X, and blows past any and all consensus building and backroom negotiations. Now, is this a sign of political naivete? I don't think so. I think what's happening here is that he is bypassing Congress to create support in the public. He is creating cognitive anchors in the voting population. Now, voting no longer really matters for him because he's in his second term, and absent a major constitutional amendment, we won't see another term for Donald Trump. But congressmen and senators absolutely have to stand for election again. And if there is now this cognitive anchor of, hey, here's a policy, and as a voter, I either like it or I don't like it, now as a legislator, you are forced to respond to it in probably a less considered, more haphazard, more heuristic way than you might otherwise.
It is brilliant in its own way. One other direction I'd like to take this in is that he does what I've seen a number of effective CEOs and other corporate executive leaders employ, which is leveraging uncertainty aversion. Don't let anybody be comfortable or feel secure. This will then drive others to seek a sense of certainty, and then you can promote yourself as the certain option. And I think he has done that masterfully in terms of getting to the second term and in terms of how he has begun these first 100 days.
It's funny. I'm looking over my notes. The first 2 points I've written down here are cognitive anchors and uncertainty. Agree entirely. His leveraging of uncertainty is masterful and unparalleled. I think he's played this in two different directions. I think during the run-up to the election itself, he projected certainty. He was calm by his standards and had reliable points that he hammered on over and over again, whether or not they were objectively correct or not. He projected that this is exactly what I mean. This is how things will go. He is a pillar of certainty. This is something that as humans we find very reassuring. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like not knowing what's going to happen. And whatever your personal opinions on Donald Trump are, the fact that he was consistent and the fact that he projected this sense of this is what will happen creates a natural sense of appetitiveness. It is something that our brains are wired to like, because if we know what's going to happen, then surviving until tomorrow is much easier. Now, post-election, I think he's flipped the script. And again, looking at the time domains here and how light switched some of these have been makes me think this is very intentional and not just an accident of an idiot child or an idiot savant. Post-election, he's actually, I would say, weaponized uncertainty. And I think this works particularly well because, again, we come back to historical norms and institutional norms of the Beltway. The Beltway is not agile. Legislators and judiciary members are not accustomed to having to make rapid decisions and respond to things quickly. He destabilizes opposition by basically moving from one topic to another, taking these wild positions, and nobody knows how to respond. And by the time they figured out how to respond, typically he's moved on to something else. If we think back, his defunding of U.S. aid was something that provoked a lot of criticism, especially within the Beltway among Congress. And there was news reports, there were articles, there were blogs and podcasts describing how terrible the thing this is. And within a week, he had gone ahead and announced the defunding of all DEIA activity in federal opportunities in federal organizations. And now, of course, nobody is talking about USA. He's moved the conversation onto something else. This chaos is not something that DC is equipped to deal with. And by using it so much, he basically ensures that his opposition can't keep putting out every fire. It's like playing whack-a-mole with the president.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know what I thought of this morning, John, in terms of what he's doing? I thought of Miller's Law. That he is leveraging Miller's Law in his opposition by putting out so many different issues for them to contend with. I keep reading every other day about how the Democrats are not putting up a fight. It's because they don't know where to start, because They're experiencing cognitive overload in dealing with all of these issues.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but I agree completely. And one of the sort of carryover effects of that is that if you can't effectively manage an opposition across all of these myriad policy points and objective points, you're basically reduced to ad hominem attacks. Now, valid or not, this is the sort of thing that Donald Trump basically ran on. But his electoral base essentially is immune to this. They no longer believe in whatever ad hominems are put forward. So these sorts of, let's call it collective opposition points of look what a bad person he is, rather than being able to respond to the 20 different things he's done in the last week and a half, end up landing very softly because, yeah, he personally doesn't care if he is liked or not liked. And those who support him no longer believe these ad hominem attacks.
So there's a couple of things that I take from that based on our prior conversations on a number of neuroscience topics, particularly related to group activities. First off, he's not beholden to social proof. He's completely insulated himself from that in terms of his own behavior. Second, because he acts unilaterally so frequently, he's not subject to groupthink.
That's a really interesting point. Wow, I'd never thought of that one before, but you're correct. It would be fascinating to be a fly on the wall in the Oval Office and just get a sense of what are the conversational dynamics among the inner circle there.
I think he takes in whatever he takes in. And if there is something, again, I'm just conjecturing. So, listeners, I'm just conjecturing. But based on what I hear and based on what I've read in other places about what it's like to work for him, you are literally working for him. You are providing some information, perhaps a point of view, maybe not even. And he will take all of that in and align it with his own personal narrative of how things are going to go. And he is not beholden to reaching some sort of consensus. It's not even an effort at collaboration, where collaboration is something where, yes, you bring in a number of different folks with different views and you hash them out, and then somebody makes the decision, but takes into deep consideration everything that's been considered. That's not necessarily how he works. He's not looking for a consensual or collaborative answer. He is looking for information that supports his overall, what I would say, ego project as leader of the free world.
And if we assume that to be true, then essentially the primary contaminating factor, and every decision-making process has contaminating factors, but the primary one in his case would probably be then confirmation bias. If, as you say, all these people are working for him to support his own initiatives, then what is provided is all going to be selectively parsed and interpreted to align with what he's already thinking or the decisions he is already inclined to make.
Yes, he's already made the decisions, and now he is looking for whatever justification. And again, truth is somewhat loose at best at times with him, so it's just going to come down to coming up with plausible arguments in many cases that support whatever action he's about to take.
What other sort of decision-making or information processing elements do you see in what we know of or what we are aware of how things run in the Trump administration? Or is that the big one that's
I think
comes to
that's the
mind?
big. I think that's the big one. I think another one I just wanted to bring out here in this forum is his leveraging of authority bias,
Hmm.
and it works both ways. He has leveraged himself. He has put himself out there as a larger than life figure, and therefore anything he says, whether it's scientifically or historically factual or not, really doesn't matter to a large segment of the population. He has established himself as the authority. On the other hand, what he has masterfully done here over the last 8 years, but I would say especially so, it's accelerated in this last election cycle and in these first 35 days, is that he has successfully neutered a lot of previously seen experts and authorities on a whole variety of topics, whether on national defense or public health or education, or even just the general tenets of how government is supposed to operate in this country.
And I think all of that feeds into what we were discussing earlier of it basically just makes it that much easier for him to achieve the outcomes that he is targeting. It weakens or even eliminates wholesale the opposition and those viewpoints and those voices who would speak against whatever purpose he's working towards.
Yes, I mean, you've reminded me many times, John, that group processes are slow. When you work in groups, when you work in a legislative branch, it's going to take quite a bit of time to come to a resolution that is satisfactory to the parties involved. And there will be a lot of compromise, a lot of give and take. That is, in effect, what Washington has been built on for 250 years. Trump is attempting to undo that and bring an acceleration in order to really affect change. Now, again, whether one likes the change that he's attempting to implement or not is not what we're talking about here. But he is accelerating the timeline for making decisions by removing a lot of the group processes built into the bureaucracy that was initially established by our founding fathers and has been expanded over the last 2+ centuries.
Your point about DC being slow is interesting because I think that in terms of implementation and execution of policy, Donald Trump has found some really interesting ways to use that to his advantage. Basically, taking advantage of one of those most powerful of behavioral phenomena, inertia. We look at things like, I come back to US aid again, but the same play has happened over and over again with myriad cabinet administration offices and different programs that have been cut, where there were those TV shots of the day that the funding cut was announced, you had people tearing down the signs on the USAID office. They moved fast. They moved very fast. And yes, it was known that there's probably going to be a legal challenge to this. And sure, 3-4 days later, there was a lawsuit announced, and it's currently very likely there will be some reinstatement of it or some statement by I will not claim that I'm a legal expert on this. I don't know if USA was established by an act of Congress or not, but regardless, it's very likely there will be at least some level of restoration of function to USAID. But Donald Trump has leveraged inertia here very effectively. How so? He's removed the infrastructure. Even if USAID is fully refunded in a month, and that would be shockingly fast in DC. I think the most quick we could reasonably expect to have this happen would be 4 months. And realistically, I think a year is probably more likely. Okay, it's refunded. What are people going to do when they go back into the office? They don't even have desks anymore. They don't have computers. They don't have the infrastructure. And so he's essentially managed to make sure that even with a restoration, the inertia that makes things take so long means that there's nothing to be done if people go back. The other aspect of inertia is overlaid on top of the workforce's self-interest, which is, okay, maybe USAID, and I come back to USAID, but this holds for any of the defunded offices. Maybe they get refunded in the coming months or coming years, but the people who work there have to eat. Most of them probably will have found new jobs by the time things are refunded. And so even if they do come back, even if these institutions, these organizations do come back in some capacity, the qualified workforce and the institutional knowledge will be largely gone. And so, again, focus on his outcome, not on his verbiage or what he's saying. Even if you have a legal refutation, simply on people being gone, the funding, the budgetary draw of these offices is going to be massively reduced. And this is all due to a very canny understanding of inertia and self-interest.
Absolutely. And as we spoke about a few moments ago with regards to bypassing the bureaucracy in order to have more efficient decision making on the things that he wants to drive certain outcomes, he will also, for outcome purposes, leverage that bureaucracy by using the courts and having things go through the courts. He is completely unafraid of having anything taken against him in a lawsuit or some type of action.
It's a fascinating play because there's a case that we are building up right now. We spoke on it just this morning, where one of the things we've speculated is, did this one particular company take a position that they knew is legally a loser just to have 6 to 12 months of market exclusivity and building up a demand base so that even if they lose the legal challenge, they have enough market share that it doesn't matter? It's a powerful position to take, but it's one that organizations and people very often don't, just because we're so conditioned to not like losing. We're so conditioned to fear the courts and fear rejection of an argument and fear that what happens if we're told our position is bad. If you can move past that fear, the courts can actually be very much to your advantage if you have the funding and time to work with them.
And that gets me to the one last leveraging of bias that Trump has masterfully done, which is the leveraging of human loss aversion. If you go back and you review some of his political campaign speeches, he reaches out to various groups, including minorities, and says, why not vote for me? What have you got to lose? Implicitly saying, look, you've already lost a lot. How much more are you really going to lose if you vote for me? And in terms of framing certain positions or certain dangers or threats, losing autonomy, losing freedom, losing status as a world superpower, all of those are things that, if you read into his speeches, he has very much put into the human psyche, into the American dialogue, into the political dialogue. And it's really brilliant because we don't like losing anything.
And this illustrates just how really good he is, because think about what this means. This means that he has successfully made uncertainty more appealing than a certain outcome. What I mean by this is, to your point, in his outreach to minorities and his outreach to people who are fearful about what might happen in the future, he's essentially positioning himself as the unknown candidate, as the change. As we talked about, people don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very powerful driver against behavior. But he's leveraged loss aversion so effectively that the uncertain candidate, the you might as well change because you know what you're getting here, is somehow more attractive. That is a sign of a very effective, very powerful student of human decision making.
Absolutely. So with that, John, what can risk managers, what can we as individuals trying to work within this chaos, what can we do?
It's a thorny question because we've talked about this before. One of the foundational challenges of risk managers is seeing the future, trying to get a really good understanding of what future probabilities are so you can take mitigating positions appropriately. I don't know that we can take mitigating positions. When we're talking about this from the point of view of, for example, somebody who works in the federal government, I know there's a huge amount of fear and uncertainty among federal employees right now because nobody knows if they're going to be next. And unless you are Donald Trump, I don't think anybody knows who's going to be next. Exactly to your point, how we kicked off this conversation, the chaos strategy, not letting people know what your next move is and making sure people are unprepared for it, by its very definition, does not lend itself to mitigating strategies. Now, if you are on the outside looking in, if you are an organizational risk manager for a private entity, you have a bit more leeway. Unless you work as a federal contractor, you're probably not going to directly lose funding or lose employment, but that does not mean you're immune to consequences. I think the best takeaway here is, do not assume that there is just chaos, that all of the plays that are made are considered and are strategic, and the tactics that are employed can usually paint a very clear picture, if you take the time to consider it, of what the outcome under consideration is. This does let you try to see the future a bit more effectively. In terms of mitigating your own position from personal loss or personal risk, I'm not sure you can, because only Donald Trump knows what his next move will be.
That's interesting. So, do you foresee that, at least for the next few months, that markets will continue to be somewhat volatile because of the underlying uncertainty that we are dealing with from day to day?
Oh, wow. You're making me commit to something here, which, okay, sure, I'll make my hot
Y-
take. No, no, no. I'll make my hot take here. I think a good deal of market volatility right now is because this is not the playbook that we saw him utilize in his first term. We saw that the markets were actually moderately enthusiastic after his election, before his inauguration. And now there's volatility. I think that's because, again, we've talked about it. Markets don't like uncertainty. Markets do not like not knowing what will happen. And we are only a little more than a month into his second term now. There's not a whole lot of base, and it's a discontinuous. I feel like that's a very important point to emphasize. It's a discontinuous second term. There's 4 years of Joe Biden in the middle there, so we don't have a lot of immediate availability about what the baseline should be. I think a lot of the volatility is adjusting to that new baseline. Yes, the tactics are very chaotic. The tactics themselves do seem haphazard, and if you are just looking at one particular headline from one day to the next, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason. I think we're going to start seeing directionally the underlying strategy. I think that we're going to start seeing what the policy direction of the administration will be, for lack of a better term. I would say 6 to 12 months or so, there probably will be some stabilization of markets, as even if the tactics themselves continue, the directional strategy will be more clear, and that will be something that canny forecasters, portfolio planners, risk managers will be able to plan against.
Do you think then that what forecasters and risk managers need to do in this uncertain period is to start to parse out some of these, in particular, very extreme policy positions, to evaluate where a likely outcome or a likely range of outcomes will be? Is that going to be the most beneficial? Is that where we want to leave this?
I think that if you are a risk manager or a market forecaster and you're not doing that, you're probably not very good at your job. You should at least be attempting to do that under any administration, under any emergent circumstances. In this case, given that there is so much unprecedented executional volatility by Donald Trump, I think that becomes a crucial part of your job. And trying to identify what those underlying outcome objectives are is going to be critically important for the ongoing health and survival of organizations.
Those are great points, John. And I would like to further emphasize that risk managers need to be aware that the possible outcomes are somewhat less certain, at least at this point in time as we speak, and that there needs to be consideration of perhaps a wider range of possible outcomes and scenarios that could play out in the coming months.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.